Good evening, everyone, depending on where you are on this planet at this point in time. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel today. So yesterday, some of you may have attended a session in plenary where there was a discussion on building partnerships for scaling up on action on child labor, where various stakeholders explored what's required to strengthen collective action on child labor. Today, we will have a bit of a deeper dive on those different elements and specifically reflected on lessons learned from the past 5 to 10 years of implementation. With a range of speakers and panelists who are going to run us through the various activities and programs that they've implemented or supported in the last years. So we will start with Shanto and Karim from the National Opinion Research Center of the University of Chicago, who are going to present the results of an assessment they did of the community development package implemented by COCO-Action companies. From there, we will move to Mr. Amani Conan and Dr. Martin Nguetia from Côte d'Ivoire, who will reflect on the lessons learned from the implementation of successive national action plans against child labor. Then Darrell Ai from Nestlé is going to give us some insights on the implementation of their child labor monitoring and remediation systems. And last but not least, we will end with Irina Holtz from the Jacobs Foundation, who's going to give us the key takeaways from the program that they implemented focused on education in Côte d'Ivoire, which was called Transforming Education in Cocoa Communities of Côte d'Ivoire. Importantly, all the panelists are going to primarily focus on what are the key lessons learned they have from those years of implementation and how we can take those lessons forward in order to achieve greater scale as well as greater impact. In that context, we will try to reflect specifically on what are the barriers for this scale-up and what could be done to address them. I'm going to stop there, not to waste any more of your time. And Shanto, please take us forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Matthias, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this interesting panel, and I would like to thank the World Cocoa Foundation for hosting this event, and also to ICI and specifically to Matthias for organizing this very interesting panel here. And I'm hoping that the discussion that we have today, findings and discussions, it will shape up the research as well as action agendas in future for reducing child labor in cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. So with that, I just wanted to start with a very brief background of the study. As Matthias mentioned, World Cocoa Foundation has commissioned a study to assess the impact of different types of interventions funded by them. I wanted to start with a very brief background of that. And I hope my screen, I can go to the, Matthew, can I go to the screen for my PPT, please? Okay, yeah, thanks. So, as all of us know that industry, different partners from the industry, they have been like implementing various interventions to fight child labor in cocoa from 2010 onwards, which gained a lot of traction after 2015, and specifically a lot of new type of interventions and more rigorous interventions took place after 2015. And industry intervention covered various types of intervention as well as different combinations. So with that, the World Cocoa Foundation commissioned NORC to study the impact of different interventions funded by the industry. And specifically, we looked into the impact of industry intervention package, which includes both in type of intervention covered through the COCO community development approach, as well as child level monitoring and remediation system approach. And in this case, it is important to emphasize that the industry intervention package encompasses different varieties of intervention, types of interventions. And in our
¿Ayudas? ¿Me ayudas? Ben?
In our study, we did not look into individual intervention, rather assessed all interventions as a whole. And at the same time, it's also important to remember that the direct beneficiaries of these interventions in individual communities varies a lot too. So with that background in mind, we started our discussion with the different implementers, and we realized that it is in order to expect to see the impact of different interventions funded by implementers, we need to identify interventions which has been implemented for quite some time, because it takes time and resources to make a dent in terms of reducing child labor. So in our approach, what we did is that we basically figured out what type of interventions to be assessed and decided to focus on communities that communities that received high exposure to interventions over an extended period of time. And specifically, we looked into the communities, or we selected the communities where interventions were implemented for at least 3 years before the study, and the communities that had 4 or more types of interventions. So the community will be qualified only if that has 4 or more interventions, which has been implemented for 3 or more years. We call these communities as mature communities. And then we used a quasi-experimental design to experimental evaluation with statistical matching and multivariate regression to assess the impact of the program. And in a very nutshell, what we tried to do is that in our evaluation, we looked into the mature communities and contrasted and compared the prevalence rate of child labor and hazardous child labor to other communities that are otherwise very similar in characteristics, but did not receive industry intervention. And that's how we identified the impact of the program, which I'm going to discuss in my next slide. So we basically did the analysis in 2 levels. We looked into the impact at the community level, and we also looked into the impact at the household level. And our study finding indicates that in mature communities where intervention has been taking place for 3 years and at least 4+ interventions have been implemented, industry intervention package has significant impact in reducing child labor and hazardous child labor. Specifically, in Côte d'Ivoire, the industry intervention package led to a 34% reduction in the rate of hazardous child labor. And in Ghana, it led to a 28% reduction in the rate of hazardous child labor in cocoa production. In addition to that, our results from the household level analysis finds very similar impact. And that actually tells us that if we even control for household level difference, we still find the similar types of impact. Just to summarize, the industry intervention package has a significant impact on child labor and hazardous child labor. It led to a reduction in the child labor and hazardous child labor in communities where these interventions were implemented for at least 3 years and has at least 4 different types of intervention. Now, while we got very, I think, encouraging results, I wanted to also quickly touch upon 3 key takeaways and agenda for future research. And the first key takeaway is related to basically coverage of coverage of different types of interventions. And specifically, while we'll find that very encouraging result in terms of the coverage of such interventions that are making difference in the ground, we do see a kind of like limited coverage of such interventions. And for example, communities covered by the COCO Action Program, where multiple interventions complementary interventions were implemented for a significant duration, that has increased over time. The number of communities exposed to such intervention that has increased over time. However, that covers only a very small fraction of cocoa communities. Probably 10% or less of the communities have been exposed to such intervention, even though the number is going up, because one point to remember is that our study took place in 2018-19.
Let's do some stuff.
And by now, it must have increased the numbers. So, and also there is a community, community child labor monitoring system, which, has been implemented, and that has another such certain amount of coverage, but overall, still a long way to go. So one important finding or discussion point that we need to think of, that is, we need to have continued investment in these treatment communities, since that's making a significant difference on the ground. And not only that, we need to find out a way to extend those beyond these treatment communities to cover more and more communities. Hopefully that will leave a lot of impact. The second key takeaway from the research is that, the vulnerability related to the vulnerability of children. From the study, we found out that there is a high incidence of exposure to multiple hazards faced by children who are working in cocoa. Specifically, if we look into these mature communities, the data actually shows that almost more than 1/3, like let's say 36% of children in these working in cocoa production in the mature communities were exposed to 3 or more hazards. And not only that, if we look into the trend in this exposure to multiple hazard, we found a concerning story. Using the data from the study that was funded by US Department of Labor, which was nationally representative study, the results were published last month. So hopefully many of us already, many of you already saw that. So from that particular study, we actually found a significant trend. We found that, I don't know whether all of you can see that, somehow like this looks little, the screen, I'm not able to see the entire stuff here. So my apologies for that. But from that particular study, what we found out that the percentage of children working in cocoa who were exposed to 4 or more hazard, that has gone up significantly between 2008-9 and 18-19. And it increased from 7% in 2008-9 to 22% in 2018-19. But please keep in mind that this is a nationally representative survey that was done not for only the WCF communities, but it was all communities, representative of all cocoa communities. Finally, so from this one particularly, we need to understand that given this significant exposure to hazardous child labor, and specifically multiple hazard, it is important to understand how to target the households where children are highly vulnerable. And at the same time, we need to find out interventions that can help these vulnerable children to come out of that significant exposure to multiple hazard. And my final takeaway is basically related to a big research gap that we have found out. Probably most of us already know about that. So if we look into the finding of the study, we do know that when a lot of interventions are made in terms of a significant portion of time, that results into reduction in hazardous child labor. But what we don't know is that how effective are the different types of interventions. Specifically, we need to have more research on what type of interventions and what combinations of interventions are effective in reducing child labor and hazardous child labor, and how this effectiveness may vary under different local conditions. For example, we don't know whether a specific type of intervention has a good result in terms of significant reduction in the rate of child labor versus another one. Or we also don't know whether 2 interventions, if they combine together, can lead the results or help us to achieve the target of reducing child labor in much faster rate. We also don't know anything about the cost effectiveness of such intervention. Obviously, there have been studies, but there is no, probably at least to my knowledge, no rigorous studies on cost effectiveness. And we also don't know which combinations of interventions are more effective and for which children. So there is a lot of future research requirement on the field. And I hope that, given these discussions, we will have opportunities to explore these areas in future. And with that, I stop and give the floor back to Matthias.
Thank you very much, Shanto. That's fascinating. Maybe before we move on to our next panelist, I just wanted to ask you at least one question building on two elements that you stress. So on one side, and that's very reassuring, and in itself, it's filling an important learning gap. We see that when there is a significant package of interventions implemented, there is also a significant impact. So that's a positive. But on one side, you highlight the need for coverage, but we know that increasing the scale of interventions, such package of interventions is relatively comprehensive, complex, and costly. And therefore, that element of cost is potentially one limitation to the scale up you're calling for. In the meantime, you highlighted importantly that there are a number of learning gaps that remain, notably on the impact of specific interventions, which might be a way to improve somehow the overall cost effectiveness of what's being done. So I know that you don't necessarily have the response, but from your kind of gut feeling, what would be the areas where you would prioritize future research to know more about the impact of specific interventions, whether in general or for specific profiles of child labor?
That's a tough question, Matthias. But again, like I would like to provide some response to that. While we don't have a strong prior about which interventions to be specifically looked into, I can share some experience which is based on our other study as well. So for example, there has been a lot of intervention focusing on increasing awareness at different levels, for example, community level, at the school level, or even at the child level and household level. But what our study funded by the US Department of Labor actually found out is that these awareness campaigns are important to increase or improve the level of awareness, but that does not necessarily convert into change in behavior. So there is a gap between the awareness and behavior. So there could be some interesting research on that particular ground. For example, if the awareness raising programs are complemented with some behavioral campaign, for example, through text messaging or through other type of innovative interventions, would they lead to result in changes in behavior? So that could be one approach of looking into that. And definitely there is not, at least to our knowledge, there are not many studies done on that. And the second one would be like, for example, we have seen that there is a significant chance of vulnerability within the communities. And given the limited resources, probably the first priority will be to identify the households where there are vulnerable children and try to solve the problem for them first. So maybe some programs that look into the identification of the households, as well as monitoring the households, such as the CLMRS approach, it would be very interesting to do a very thorough and robust evaluation of such program. And there are other programs as well, but as I was telling, it is very difficult to pick, but these are the things that come in my mind based on our understanding.
Thank you very much. I see that we've got a few clarifying questions from the audience, so I'm maybe going to take a quick one, which should be relatively straightforward to answer for you in terms of what are the main hazards that children are confronted with when we're referring to the fact that we've got a stronger proportion of children exposed to hazards.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And, in the interest of time, I did not present that. But from the study, we found out that the main type of hazards where most of the children were exposed were use of sharp tool, exposure to agrochemical, then carrying heavy load, and land clearing. So those are the four major type of hazards faced by the children. And I think when we talked about 3 or more hazard, most of the children were involved in one of these 4.
Thank you very much. So again, key takeaway, when a significant level of intervention is being done, there is a significant impact, but nevertheless, there is still some learning gaps in terms of specific impact of specific interventions in general, but also for specific children. I think your element about, proportion of children exposed to 4 or more hazards is also a key element, notably in terms of targeting, but we will probably have the occasion to get back to that, and maybe also potentially after Darrell's presentation. But for now, we will move on to Mr. Amani Conan du Comité national de surveillance sur la lutte contre le travail des enfants, et son collègue, le Dr Martin Nguetia, directeur de la lutte contre le travail des enfants de Côte d'Ivoire. C'est à vous, merci.
Merci. Je voudrais dire merci à Mathias, à tous les participants et principalement à la World Cocoa Foundation qui nous a associés à ce panel. Il faut bien admettre que l'exploitation du travail des enfants dans la chaîne d'approvisionnement du cacao est une des menaces les plus sérieuses à la durabilité de l'économie cacaoyère mondiale. Pour se rendre compte de cette évidence, il suffit de se référer aux pressions exercées sur l'industrie du cacao et du chocolat par certaines organisations de défense des droits de l'homme et même par des membres du Congrès américain qui appellent à interdire l'importation sur le territoire américain du cacao en provenance de la Côte d'Ivoire au motif que ce cacao serait produit par la main-d'œuvre enfantine. Effectivement, la question du travail des enfants dans la production du cacao doit être traitée avec diligence et beaucoup de rigueur, car il s'agit non seulement d'un problème éthique et moral, mais également d'un problème de droits humains. En effet, nul n'a le droit de faire exécuter à un enfant, pour quelque raison que ce soit, une activité qui le mette en danger ou qui affecte sa santé, sa croissance, ainsi que son équilibre physique et mental. De même que nul n'a le droit de tirer avantage du travail des enfants. C'est donc fort de cette conviction que la Côte d'Ivoire et les acteurs de la chaîne de valeur du cacao ont pris et continuent de prendre leur part de responsabilité dans la lutte contre ce phénomène. Leurs engagements et leur détermination à éliminer le travail des enfants dans la cacaoculture se sont matérialisés par la mise en œuvre de nombreuses initiatives, aussi bien publiques que privées. Mais en dépit des efforts consentis, force est de reconnaître que les résultats obtenus et les progrès réalisés ne sont pas à la hauteur de nos attentes, puisque les indicateurs de mesure du travail des enfants montrent bien que le phénomène persiste. Alors, en Côte d'Ivoire, ce constat a amené le gouvernement et ses partenaires à faire le diagnostic des interventions. Tout à l'heure, je me rends compte qu'avec l'intervention de Chantou, que l'industrie également a fait l'évaluation de l'efficacité de ces interventions. Alors, à travers l'évaluation de l'efficacité de nos interventions, nous avons pu tirer des leçons. Alors, quelles sont les leçons apprises de cette évaluation de notre intervention, de notre stratégie nationale? Nous avons principalement appris 3 leçons. La première leçon, c'est qu'un certain type d'intervention ont prouvé effectivement leur efficacité à impacter le travail des enfants. Entre autres, il s'agit des interventions qui visent à améliorer l'accès des enfants à l'éducation. Ensuite, il y a les types d'interventions qui visent à soutenir la formation professionnelle et l'employabilité des jeunes. Nous avons également les types d'interventions qui vise à améliorer l'accès des communautés aux services sociaux de base. Ensuite, des interventions visant à améliorer les revenus et les conditions de vie des paysans. Nous avons également pu noter les interventions qui visent à sensibiliser, à impliquer et à autonomiser les communautés dans la lutte contre le travail des enfants. Je veux parler entre autres des plans d'action communautaires. Ce sont effectivement des types d'interventions qui impactent véritablement le travail des enfants. Comme autre type d'intervention efficace que nous avons pu noter, il s'agit des interventions qui visent à soutenir l'autonomisation des femmes et ainsi que leur accès au crédit, notamment les AVEC, Associations villageoises d'épargne et de crédit. Nous avons également pu noter les interventions qui visent à garantir ou assurer la transparence de la chaîne d'approvisionnement du cacao, notamment à travers la mise en place de mécanismes de contrôle et de suivi du travail des enfants. En Côte d'Ivoire, nous avons l'exemple bien connu du SOSTECI. Et enfin, nous avons également pu noter comme intervention efficace toutes les initiatives qui visent à renforcer l'application de la loi, c'est-à-dire la répression. Pour nous, c'est un aspect très important. En même temps que nous protégeons les enfants victimes, il y a derrière ces enfants ceux-là qui les utilisent ou qui les soumettent au trafic d'enfants. La Côte d'Ivoire a des lois et nous avons mis un accent particulier à la mise en œuvre de ces lois. Donc, voici la première leçon que nous avons tirée de l'analyse de l'efficacité de notre intervention, de nos stratégies. La deuxième leçon que nous avons tirée de cette évaluation, nous avons dit, bien que les initiatives soient pertinentes et potentiellement capables d'influencer le travail des enfants, elles ne permettent pas cependant de générer suffisamment d'impact sur le travail des enfants. C'est-à-dire, ce sont des interventions efficaces qui ont donné leurs preuves, mais les résultats de ces interventions ne sont pas suffisamment significatifs. Et cela pour plusieurs raisons. D'abord, les tailles des projets sont d'envergure relativement petite. Ce sont généralement des projets pilotes et donc ne permettent pas de toucher le maximum de bénéficiaires ou de communautés pour induire le changement souhaité. La deuxième raison, il s'agit de projets sectoriels et isolés. Ces projets isolés, c'est-à-dire chaque intervenant développe son projet. Donc, quand vous prenez l'ensemble de ces projets, il n'existe aucun lien fonctionnel, aucun lien stratégique entre ces projets-là. Il n'y a aucun lien de complémentarité. Alors, cette logique de projet entraîne bien souvent une dispersion des ressources et des forces, voire même une certaine concurrence entre les projets, ce qui ne permet pas d'optimiser les résultats des efforts consentis. Et la troisième et dernière raison, c'est que certaines initiatives privées sont développées de façon parallèle à la stratégie nationale et même souvent en dehors des objectifs et des priorités définis par le gouvernement. Ces initiatives parallèles ont leurs propres objectifs et leur propre cadre de résultats qui sont souvent différents, voire même divergents avec ceux du gouvernement. Alors, une telle situation rend difficile la coordination et la mise en place d'un cadre de redevabilité efficace. Nous avons également pu tirer une troisième leçon qui est essentielle après, je vais dire, l'évaluation de nos stratégies en Côte d'Ivoire. Nous sommes assis, le gouvernement et ses partenaires, nous avons fait en quelque sorte, le point. Qu'est-ce qui marche, qu'est-ce qui ne marche pas, afin de pouvoir nous projeter efficacement dans le futur. Et donc, la troisième leçon que nous avons tirée, c'est que le travail des enfants dans le cacao ne peut pas être efficacement adressé en se limitant au seul secteur du cacao et aux initiatives des seuls acteurs du cacao. En effet, le travail des enfants dans le cacao est un phénomène saisonnier qui évolue selon les cycles de culture du cacao. Un enfant, par exemple, travaillant dans le cacao aujourd'hui peut se retrouver demain à travailler dans un autre secteur d'activité autre que le cacao et par la suite revenir encore dans le cacao selon les périodes. Donc, si vous-même, vous avez réussi à éliminer le travail des enfants dans votre chaîne d'approvisionnement et que à côté, peut-être dans la riziculture ou dans une culture vivrière à côté, l'enfant se retrouve là-bas, ne soyez pas, je vais dire, sûr que cet enfant ne reviendra plus dans votre chaîne d'approvisionnement. Donc, pour nous, pour adresser efficacement le travail des enfants dans la cacaoculture, il faut également élargir le cadre d'intervention et de partenariat. Alors, comment tirer parti de ces leçons apprises? Puisque nous avons appris ces leçons, comment s'appuyer sur ces leçons apprises pour améliorer nos interventions? Alors, tout d'abord, il faudrait faire en sorte que les stratégies qui ont montré leur efficacité à impacter le travail des enfants puissent être déployées à une échelle plus grande afin de générer des résultats plus significatifs. Alors, cela implique d'accroître non seulement les investissements, mais également d'élargir le partenariat et non pas se limiter seulement aux seuls acteurs du cacao. Deuxièmement, il faudrait également contribuer, il faudrait plutôt combiner l'approche projet avec l'approche système. Cela veut dire quoi? Il faut établir un lien fonctionnel, établir un lien stratégique entre les différents projets pour ne éviter les doubles emplois, pour éviter la superposition des projets dans une seule zone géographique. On pourrait prendre le cas de Soubré, par exemple, où il y a une concentration de projets, alors que dans d'autres zones où le travail des enfants existe, il n'y a pas suffisamment de projets. D'autre part, il faut également que ces projets sectoriels aient un lien fonctionnel, un lien stratégique avec le plan d'action national du gouvernement. Parce que, après tout, c'est le gouvernement qui conduit la politique nationale pour l'élimination du travail des enfants. Nous avons adopté un plan d'action national. Nous sommes au 3e. En principe, toutes les initiatives, que ce soit privées ou autres, devraient s'inscrire dans le plan d'action national. Nous avons des activités selon le mandat de telle ou telle organisation. Ils s'approchent des agences gouvernementales qui ont en charge la mise en œuvre de ce plan. Ils peuvent leur dire, par exemple, nous, en fonction de notre mandat, nous voulons vous accompagner dans la mise en œuvre de ce plan. Donc, nous décidons de financer ou de mettre en œuvre tel aspect du plan d'action national. Parce que la mise en œuvre d'autres initiatives qui rentrent en concurrence avec le plan d'action national ne permettent pas véritablement de capitaliser les efforts et d'affirmer qu'effectivement, le plan d'action national a été mis en œuvre. Alors, dans cette perspective, il est indispensable de définir des indicateurs communs de progrès, ainsi qu'un cadre commun de résultats et de redevabilité. Tout cela chapeauté par le gouvernement. Donc, voici résumé un peu les leçons tirées de notre stratégie nationale que nous avons développée à travers le plan d'action national et les perspectives, c'est-à-dire les stratégies que nous voulons ensemble mettre en place avec les partenaires, que ce soit privés, l'industrie ou les autres organisations du système des Nations Unies. Nous disons, pour conclure, que nous avons un plan d'action national qui adresse le travail des enfants dans toutes ses facettes. Nous avons besoin de leur appui. Et nous ne sommes pas contre le fait que les partenaires développent leurs propres projets, mais nous demandons que ces projets aient un lien stratégique avec la stratégie nationale pour que nous puissions ensemble mettre en place un cadre de résultats formels, un cadre de redevabilité. Voici un peu, Mathias, ce que je voulais dire comme propos introductifs, tout en étant ouvert à vos questions qui certainement nous permettront d'aller plus en détail. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Amani. Donc, je retiens principalement de votre intervention que ce soit au niveau des différentes interventions, y compris des actions du gouvernement, un grand nombre de progrès ont été accomplis, mais qu'on a pu voir que pour l'instant, les résultats n'étaient pas suffisants, d'où la nécessité d'une mise à l'échelle de ces interventions, de mobiliser plus de ressources. Le deuxième élément important étant dans ce cadre d'améliorer la synergie et la coordination entre les acteurs. Et je pense qu'on reviendra à cette question de la synergie et la complémentarité entre les systèmes publics, les systèmes communautaires et les systèmes privés ultérieurement dans la discussion. Mais un autre point que j'ai noté, c'était sur cette question d'arriver aussi à mobiliser de nouveaux partenaires et de nouveaux financements. Et effectivement, on va dire, au-delà des acteurs traditionnels impliqués, que sont le gouvernement d'un côté et l'industrie de l'autre, traditionnellement depuis des années et des années, on voit la nécessité, compte tenu de l'ampleur des besoins et de l'ampleur des ressources requises, qu'il faut pouvoir aussi élargir les partenariats, entre autres, pour pouvoir aussi augmenter les financements disponibles. À votre avis, au-delà de ces acteurs traditionnels que sont le gouvernement et l'industrie, quels sont les types d'acteurs qui seraient susceptibles d'être mobilisés et comment arriver à les mobiliser sur cette question de la lutte contre le travail des enfants dont on a l'impression qu'elle a été principalement l'affaire du gouvernement et de l'industrie depuis bientôt 20 ans.
Merci, mais il y a d'autres bailleurs, notamment, je fais allusion à l'Union européenne. Vous savez très bien qu'au niveau de l'Europe, il y a des législations de plus en plus contraignantes qui sont en train d'être élaborées, qui concernent les aspects sociaux, notamment des chaînes d'approvisionnement, notamment la lutte contre le travail des enfants, et même également de l'autre côté les aspects environnementaux qui concernent la déforestation. Et même, je pourrais dire que la lutte contre le travail des enfants devient en plus, fait partie maintenant des critères de conditionnalité de l'aide au développement, même la Banque mondiale, etc. Donc, je pense que ce sont des bailleurs potentiels, des acteurs vers qui on pourrait partir, puisque cette question du travail des enfants et la question également de la déforestation, le cacao qui détruit la forêt, tout cela fait partie maintenant d'un ensemble qui est regardé de près par les bailleurs. Donc, j'imagine qu'on pourrait élargir la recherche de nouveaux partenariats vers ces institutions-là.
Avec plus d'exigences viennent plus de responsabilités et la lutte contre le travail des enfants est une responsabilité partagée. Merci beaucoup et on reviendra ultérieurement sur cette question absolument clé de la coordination des interventions et de la synergie des différents systèmes. Mais pour l'instant, on va peut-être passer à Darrell de Nestlé.
Thanks, Matthias. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Will my presentation go up? Anyway, while that is going up, I'm going to cover due diligence in the supply chain. I'm going to look at how a child labour monitoring remediation system actually works and the results from it. So next slide, please. System starts in the centre there. We have community liaison people. These are people selected from the community, and what they do is to raise awareness about child labour in the community, and they also check up on what the kids of the farmers in our supply chain are doing. Now, important to note, we're not just interested in what they're doing on the cocoa farm, but any tasks. Could be carrying water, carrying firewood, for instance. So they're checking up on what the kids are doing with household visits and farm visits. And this data is being recorded in a database. It's all linked through smartphones. There's an immense amount of data that comes through here. When children are identified as doing hazardous tasks, there's a further follow-up to understand exactly what's happening, the reasons and so on. This is discussed with the other actors in the supply chain, the cooperative, the NGO we work with, ICI, our supplier. And then we decide what remediation to do. And then because we're going back and following up with the kids and checking up their progress, there's a measurement automatically built into the system so we can see how we're doing. To give an idea of the scale that which our system's work in, it's in 87 cooperatives in Côte d'Ivoire, covering over 73,000 farmers, and we've also started in Ghana with about 1,600 community liaison people in the system. Next slide, please. So how do we help? Well, it's basically on remediation and prevention. It can be at different levels. Help for the parents, for instance, so real practical help. We've put together work groups, such as groups of young adults who can do some of the hazardous activities on the farm, like pruning or pesticide spraying. We're doing income generating activities for the households to increase the income of the household. And real practical help, one of the most frequent hazardous activities is carrying heavy loads. But a man can use a wheelbarrow and carry what he was given 5 kids to carry. Around improving access to education, we've built schools, we've given school kits, partnered with the Trek Foundation with Bridging Schools. We've sorted out birth certificates for kids who don't have them and helped women in their literacy. So this is the kind of work that's orientated within the child labour system. And of course, there's lots of other work that also impacts child labour that goes right across the Nestlé Cocoa Plan, such as gender awareness or improving agricultural practices on the cocoa farm. Next slide, please. So the results. So you can see this is something that's happening at scale with over 78,000 kids being monitored. And it's a system that's finding the child labourers. And this was a key aspect that was important to us as we started this. Was it actually going to identify the child labourers? And it is. So we're seeing 23% of the kids we're checking out actually doing some form of hazardous task. We're helping the kids with multiple forms of remediation. And then we're seeing around half the kids actually come out of child labour. So it's a system which works. Of course, there's plenty more to do, but to see the kids who have been helped gives us a lot of heart to continue this. And you can see the full numbers in the 2 reports we've produced on this that are available on Nestlé Cocoa Plan website from 2017 and 2019. Next slide, please. Of course, each situation, every child situation is different. And it's one thing to look at the statistics and percentages and so on, but it's very impersonal. And when you actually meet the children and meet the parents, then you realize how many different situations there are out there. And this is a family we profile in our report. Raul, in the pink there, he was one of the more challenging cases. We sorted out a carpentry apprenticeship for him, but he dropped out of it and continued doing hazardous tasks on the farm. By contrast, his two brothers, they were also doing hazardous tasks before. We improved their access to education, and they came out of doing the hazardous tasks. So it gives you an idea of the complexity of the situations we have to deal with. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do now? Well, we need to scale up these systems. As been said before, from Nork and Amani, some of these systems are just too small. They're not covering enough of the country, and the industry and the other actors can do more to scale up these proven solutions. We need to feed back and learn. Like we put in our last child labour report, we were identifying the success rate of different kinds of remediation, and our work is still in its early days. We can learn a lot faster if we feed back to each other and learn from each other. We need to improve the effectiveness of the systems. We need to know what works faster. And we need to work both in our supply chain and in the wider landscape. So we need to help the kids in our supply chain, and we can do that now. And we can work on the bigger systemic issues together with government, with other industry. But we can do both, and it's not one or the other. Next slide, please. So what remains to be done? So picking up on Amani's comments, we need more coordination and complementarity with national systems. With the work we've done, we can help direct national systems to the higher risk areas. And equally, national systems can help with remediation with the cases we find. And we need to strengthen the capacity of supply chain systems. We've shown they're effective. Ideally, we would like, for instance, the cooperatives, they're already taking a very big part in the monitoring of child labour. We would like them to take a bigger part in the remediation and prevention work. Further, we can share information with other actors. We can work together in communities where we have farmers supplying different supply chains, and we can work together on remediation in those communities. So I hope that helps to understand what CLMRS is all about, how it does focus on supply chain, but has much wider effects as well. The remediation and prevention work goes beyond just the farmers in our supply chain and into the communities where they're working. So I think that concludes my presentation. So you can go on to the next slide. Thanks very much. Back to Matthias.
Thanks, Darrell, and thanks for being also so concise and on time. Maybe because I think there were a few interesting elements in your presentation that also relates to what was said by the other panelists, but one specific question which somehow, links back to some of the elements that Chantal highlighted. I'd like to know, as a company, and in order to make your systems more cost-effective and therefore more scalable and therefore more impactful, what are the elements where additional learning would help? What are the things where you would need to know more in order to make the entire thing more cost-effective and more scalable?
Well, one area would be to focus more on the higher risk cases. So if there's a way we could identify higher risk communities, families, or children, then we could focus resources more effectively. So some way of identifying that, either from our own data or from national data, would be very useful.
So thanks. There's, I mean, maybe, you know, a follow-up question, but more to Chanto, but in relation to Darrell's presentation. When you see the description of such a system, and referring back to your point about those kids that are most at risk or in the more severe conditions because they are undertaking 4 or more hazards, you know, what do you see as a potential, or maybe for Karim, of such a system like Darrell described, to be able to target most effectively the resources that are used for prevention and remediation activities?
Right. I think this is a very interesting question, and we have also been like, kind of advocating for something like that, because we have limited amount of resources, and there is a important need to identify the households which are in most need, in terms of like reducing the vulnerability. So we have been discussing the possibility of identifying, for the targeting perspective, scientifically designed tool that can easily identify the households. And the process CLMRS currently is using, obviously, that is probably most likely foolproof because it is based on observation, right? The agents go there and then view that. But in terms of scalability, as you were mentioning, it probably may not be very easy to scale it up because of the resource requirement. And that's where data-driven approach can help. And we are actually thinking of something similar on the ground, that given the data we have collected and other data available, is it possible to look into household characteristics and say how likely is the particular household to have children at risk without the proper current observation? Because you cannot go to the field and see what the child is doing if you really need to scale up for multiple, millions of households. But scientifically designed tool can probably help that. And NORC is very interested in moving to the approach, and we are presently thinking of that. And hopefully we'll have something to share with you, because we understand that the CLMRS approach is very rigorous, but probably for outreach purpose, we need to be more, kind of using data-driven approach to identify maybe communities as well as within a particular community, which are the households that could be most at risk.
Thanks, Chanto. So yeah, no, I mean, from all of that, there's a clear call for both, innovation and learning as one key barrier to scalability, notably to make all the interventions more cost effective. There's another element in your presentation, Darrell, that somehow piqued my attention. That's your kind of mutual call for both, increasing the scale of supply chain systems, but you mentioned also the need for a landscape approach in parallel, which I think also links back to your call for better coordination and linkages, as well as the similar call that was done by Mr. Amani earlier. So could you just give us a few practical examples of where such landscape approaches could be useful when it comes to child labor prevention or remediation?
Well, in the education area, we've done some important interventions in education. It's a very important part of getting kids out of child labor, to give them a real alternative, because it's not surprising they fall into child labor if there isn't a school to go to, or there's not enough capacity in the schools. So work around education. It's not the only thing, it's not a silver bullet, but it is critical in this. And no, we're happy to do things in our supply chain, but it would be better to do things at a national scale in the education system. We've learned a lot. I think our work with TREC showed what are the possibilities with, for instance, improving the quality of education. And that's great at that scale, but now it would be brilliant if that was really done at a national scale through the education system of the Côte d'Ivoire. And I think so that's a prime example of where we can work together. And yeah, definitely.
So thanks a lot, Darrell. So clearly, on one side, the strengths of supply chain systems, notably when it comes to exercising your due diligence, but also being able to to monitor, identify the children that are most at risk and target effectively assistance. But in the meantime, a few areas on the prevention side, notably on education, where it makes sense to have a more jointed approach. I think that also makes a beautiful transition to the presentation of Irina. So thanks again, Darrell, and Irina, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, dear co-panelists. Thanks, Matthias. If you could project the slides, please. So while waiting, my name is Irina Hotz. I work for the Jacobs Foundation, and I'm here to speak a little bit more about the learnings from the TREC program. So not necessarily about child labor per se, but really our experiences in quality education and how it could be useful when thinking about some of the key questions many of you have already highlighted in terms of scale and effectiveness of programs. It's actually, I wanted to start, it's been a very insightful conference so far. I think there's a lot of common understanding and alignment of the key challenges we're all facing. And I joined the session on the learnings around COCO action yesterday, and it took me back to 2016 when we as a foundation actually for the first time started interacting with the cocoa and chocolate industry. We had at that point in time actually recently launched the foundation's largest ever single country program called TREC, endowed with $50 million with the objective to really mobilize an ecosystem of diverse stakeholders with the goal of providing every child with the opportunity to develop their full potential. We knew we could not change the needle alone and realized that with the launch of Cocoa Action, the cocoa and chocolate industry were substantial to drive large-scale change jointly with the government and jointly with other funders. Access to education, I think we all agree, was and is fundamental to many of the challenges we face in the short, medium, and long term. And so we thought this topic would certainly speak to all the major players, as education provides children with the opportunity to thrive, breaking the cycle of poverty, and contributing to addressing one of the child labor's root causes. Well, next slide, please. The answers we actually got from many of the industry partners were, to say the least, mostly hesitant. I was actually able to dig out this almost archivable slide from Shoko Vision 2016 that we presented in, following up on many of the discussions we had with industries, and it showed the difficulty of many of our interlocutors that they had to invest in education. In the eyes of many industry players, there wasn't a sufficient business case to invest in education. Infrastructure, possibly yes, but not in education quality. So quality education did not have the sufficient immediate impact on the targets they had set themselves at that time on productivity, on women empowerment, and on child labor. So this is 4 years ago, and as we have heard today, I'm actually very proud and humbled to say that we have come a very long way since. So we have, as a foundation with TREC, we have partnered directly with 12 cocoa and chocolate companies, 8 ministries, 20 civil society organizations, and academia in joint projects on quality education and to foster early childhood development. So within these partnerships, we have co-funded many promising and in themselves successful education approaches, contributing to preventing and remediating also child labor, including bridging classes, as Daryl just mentioned, with Nestle, preschool provisions, educator training, parental training on early childhood development, and teacher training on learner-centered pedagogies. Next slide, please. However, what we saw in many of these initiatives, and Amani, you mentioned that as well, and including our own, there were very small scale, isolated projects. While in themselves oftentimes successful, in sum and in aggregation, all of these projects haven't yet been enough to cover the growing need. Through the years, we, as many of you in this call, have come to understand that in order to promote children's rights effectively and sustainably, a continued shift in mindset and action from all stakeholders was required. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in my view, those shifts are summarized in 3 key areas. I think first and foremost, it's about tackling the root causes of child labor and addressing poverty, health, nutrition, and education. 2, it means focusing on simple evidence-based approaches. And 3, joining forces to work systemically, starting in the areas of the greatest need. So when we think about tackling the root causes, I think we understand child labor to be a symptom that is driven by many dimensions affecting and influencing families, caregivers, and children's choices. I think seeking the best for their children and families with often limited means, parents face difficult choices. This includes the question of enrolling and keeping children in school, which actually may not always seem to be the best choice. If the school is too far away, indirect schooling costs for uniforms and materials amounting up to $32 per child per year may be excessive for the household budget. And the perception of the education quality might just not be enough. So in doing a cost-benefit analysis, this oftentimes will impact a household decision and children's trajectory in school. I think some statistics regarding the quality, which is something we have been focusing on as a foundation very strongly, is that the most recent Liaison report in Côte d'Ivoire has shown that almost 50% of all children in Côte d'Ivoire, unfortunately, do not acquire the minimum reading requirements at the end of primary school. So simply building schools and providing materials has shown to not be enough. And evidence is showing us correlations between quality education, school attendance, and lower child labor risks. Actually, a representative survey conducted in 2020 across the cocoa growing area in Côte d'Ivoire showed that schools with smaller class sizes and lower repetition rates and teacher engagement had significantly higher attendance rates. 2, focusing on simple evidence-based solutions. I think we know that multidimensional issues such as child labor is very complex and doesn't have any easy solution. Regardless of the complexity, however, experience across the globe and also from our own education programs with TREC has shown that scaling actually requires very simple solutions developed under the, I would say, principle of subtracting activities rather than adding activities within the same program. As effective as a single program may be on a small scale, combining everything we believe and know is effective, teacher training, community support, mentoring, VSLAs, canteens, scaling it up as an entire program, and we've heard this, I think, in the panel before, through governmental or market systems is extremely difficult and complex. So evidence worldwide shows actually that only 1 in 20 pilot projects is effectively scaled. And in order to reach scale, it takes from its inception to scale 10 to 15 years. So scaling requires not only to understand if an approach is working well overall, but much more which of its specific elements are most effective and scalable. To be very honest, we have ourselves been victim of this fallacy. And I think within the 5 years of our program, we ourselves have also embarked on a sort of a pruning process. So to give you an example, in 2017, together with 12 cocoa and chocolate companies, we launched 12 what we called pilot to scale projects endorsed by the government. And today, actually, we have continued only with the 6 most successful approaches based on independent evaluations. And as we continue, we are currently mandating further rigorous evaluations to deepen our understanding of the key components of each approach, to prepare for the scale of only the most effective elements and principles through large scale programs with government and market systems. Last but not least, joining forces to work systemically to promote these large scale programs and also to focus on areas of greatest needs. I think, and we've heard this multiple times over the last 2 days, and I will repeat it again, we need, in order to work systemically, we need to have that shift from a project logic to a system logic. With this, I mean moving away from company and organization individual projects and joining resources and expertise to work through existing systems. It also means, as Daryl mentioned, and Amani, you mentioned as well, taking a landscape approach, scaling across entire areas rather than a community by community and individual supply chain exclusive approach. This is even more evident to us in the case of education. So when we started thinking about scaling teaching at the right level methodology, or PEC, the Programme d'enseignement ciblé, as it's called in Côte d'Ivoire, to improve learning outcomes, we saw that economies of scale and efficiency could only be achieved when working with the government through its own education delivery system. This allows scaling sustainably by entire education regions, reaching all schools in a specific area, rather than individual schools scattered across various administrative entities. So in order to do so, it's not only coordinated and aligned, but joint action that is called for in a strong partnership with all involved stakeholders, including government, industry, civil society, and of course, other donors. I think of all of these three areas that I've been presenting in terms of mindset shift, I think this last one continues to be the biggest challenge. Joining forces really requires a common vision and joint agreement and understanding of objectives and partnership principles. It requires a shared understanding of the need and of priority areas. And last but not least, it also requires a deep level of trust amongst all partners that takes time and patience to build. This being said, as already outlined by colleagues here on the panel, there are many positive signs. So without the energetic moves we have seen in this direction, the ongoing discussions of a comprehensive Children First PPP would never have started. And even more encouragingly, two pooled funding initiatives called Clé and Elan have been put forward this year as a concrete contribution to the PPP, the National Education and Child Labor Strategies. The two initiatives, with a target capitalization of $150 million, aim to scale access to quality education and early childhood development services across the cocoa growing areas through government systems. They have already been endorsed by the Côte d'Ivoire Council of Ministers this year, 14 visionary cocoa and chocolate companies, and 3 philanthropic foundations. More to join hopefully soon. And I'll finish with this, Matthias. I think while we all agree a lot remains to be done, these recent moves show that there is a local education ecosystem that is ready to pick up the challenge and start working on tackling those root causes of child labor, focusing on very simple and clearly outlined evidence-informed approaches, and investing in a joint landscape approach in the areas of greatest needs. So I'll stop here and happy to answer questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Irina, and thanks also for ending on this note of hope. I've got maybe one slightly provocative question for you, and as this is a child labor panel, and all of the panelists have rightly focused on the need for learning and evidence-based interventions, including yourself. But as we can see from the the research that's been done by NORC, most child laborers are going to school. So is this not an area where there is still a learning gap? And on your side, is there any plan, as part of TREC or within Clé and Elan, to better explore the linkages between education or quality education or specific education interventions and an impact on child labor reduction?
Thanks, Matthias, for feeding that back to me. I think the question is multifold, because as I already mentioned, I think education has an impact on multiple mid, short-term, and long-term dimensions. In the mid to long term, I think there is no need to highlight the evidence that increased education will help break the poverty cycle and will ultimately also help contributing to the communities and forward, I think, that the society as a whole also remediating or addressing or preventing the child labor challenge. On the short term, in terms of evidence, you are absolutely right. There's a body of evidence that shows that better quality schools or better quality education leads to an increased I would say, perception of benefits from schooling from families and parents. And then there's a body of evidence that shows that there's an increased perception of benefits leads to increased schooling and increased attendance rates. And I think it's also important to differentiate between enrollment and attendance rates when we think about the effect of quality education and exposure to child labor. Although I think, yeah, it's not the simple provision of quality education will not solve entirely, I think, the child labor challenge. And last but not least, where are the gaps? I think this has also been mentioned, by Chantal. Many of these, I would say, direct links between activities that address root causes and child labor remain to be determined. And actually, as part of the Clé and Élan partnership, we are envisioning to fund a randomized controlled trial looking at how the provision of quality education, cash transfers, actually impact directly the prevalence of child labor. So we don't have that information yet, but of course we would hope to contribute to a growing body of evidence to shed light on also, I think, the most effective elements and cost-effective solutions we can all invest in further.
Thanks a lot, Irina. So I think
Matthias, can I
just please
take
just
1 minute? Very interesting finding, which based on what Irina mentioned. In our study, we found out some relationship between the education and the child labor. Obviously, it was not a focus, but we found out that the household heads who kind of valued education, for example, believed that children should have at least secondary education and more, those households had much lower child labor rates and hazardous child labor rates than other households. And that was pretty robust. But what we don't know is that what made them to think that there is a value of education. Maybe the quality of the school is good there. So there is a lot of areas where this subtle relationship can be tested and the effectiveness can be further improved through these channels.
Thanks a lot, Chantal, for this additional, very, very useful addition. Beyond several elements that have been mentioned and covered already in terms of the need for more innovation, additional learning, in order to make all those interventions more impactful and cost-effective. In this general call to scale that you've all made, and in that sense, I see a lot of alignment. I think all of you basically also clearly called for more coordination, more alignment, more complementarity, more synergy, more joint action. And on that, I like to go back to Mr. Amani and to one of the points you made, Mr. Amani. If I remember correctly, I think you mentioned the need to somehow define, building on national priorities, define priorities, define roles and responsibilities, and you were referring to the need for a common results framework, more transparency and more accountability. Could you maybe tell us a bit more on that, and what do you have in mind, and how the definition of such a common result framework would help when it comes to improving coordination and complementarity of different systems? Amani, je ne sais pas si ma question était claire ou si tu veux que je la reformule rapidement en français.
Non, c'est bon, j'ai compris. Je voudrais dire merci à Irina. J'ai beaucoup apprécié son intervention. Elle parle de travailler dans des systèmes existants. Quand elle parle de travailler avec le gouvernement, en donnant l'exemple du projet TREC, vraiment, je suis en tout cas d'avis avec ce qu'elle a dit. Et j'ai également apprécié l'intervention de notre ami Darrell de Nestlé également. Et je me rends compte que nous nous inscrivons dans le même esprit. Et sur le terrain ici en Côte d'Ivoire, nous avons engagé depuis un certain nombre de temps des discussions public-privé, notamment avec l'industrie, mais également avec les autres parties prenantes telles que ILO, telles que UNICEF, parce que nous sommes tous rendus à l'évidence que si nous ne nous mettons pas ensemble, c'est-à-dire se mettre ensemble, ça ne veut pas dire travailler côte à côte de façon parallèle, mais je veux dire mettre ensemble nos forces, nos ressources et mettre également, ce qui est important, en place un cadre de redevabilité. Certes, chaque organisation a son mandat propre, mais ce qui nous réunit, c'est l'objectif, c'est l'intérêt supérieur des enfants, c'est l'élimination du travail des enfants dans la chaîne de valeur du cacao. C'est ce qui nous réunit. Donc, en ce moment-là, il faut que nous prenions conscience que si nous partons en rang dispersé, nous n'arriverons pas à atteindre nos objectifs. Aussi bien le gouvernement de la Côte d'Ivoire en tant que premier producteur mondial de fèves de cacao, l'industrie, que ce soit ceux qui transforment le cacao, que ce soit ceux qui achètent le cacao, que ce soit ceux qui font le chocolat, nous avons tous intérêt à travailler ensemble. Mais pour pouvoir mesurer efficacement nos efforts, c'est de mettre en place un cadre de résultats. Par exemple, le programme TREC doit s'intégrer dans le cadre de résultats du gouvernement, de sorte qu'on puisse à la fin capitaliser tout cela. Tous les programmes qui sont mis en place, que ce soit par Nestlé, nous par exemple au CNS, le Comité national de surveillance, j'ai vu tout à l'heure que M. Darel a présenté leur système de suivi du travail des enfants avec un certain nombre de résultats appréciables. Mais certainement qu'il est informé aussi que la Côte d'Ivoire, le gouvernement a mis en place son système qui est le SOSTECI. Donc pour nous, ce qui est important, c'est que ce système-là que vient de présenter M. Darel, ces résultats-là puissent être capitalisés au niveau du SOSTECI. Mais nous disons que peut-être pour permettre cela, il faudrait que nous ayons des indicateurs communs pour assurer une coordination, pour évaluer un système ou des résultats. Il faut qu'il y ait des indicateurs communs. Il faut qu'il y ait un cadre commun de résultats et un cadre conjoint de redevabilité. Pour nous, si on est d'accord sur ça, sur nos initiatives que nous sommes en train de discuter avec l'industrie et les autres parties prenantes, nous aboutissons vraiment à établir formellement un cadre de résultats communs et des indicateurs communs et un cadre de redevabilité. Je pense qu'on pourra aller de l'avant. Parce qu'après tout, la lutte contre le travail des enfants, c'est une question de développement social et économique. Donc, c'est ensemble, la Côte d'Ivoire, en tant que gouvernement et ses partenaires, c'est ensemble qu'on peut relever le défi de l'élimination du travail des enfants. Donc, j'ai vraiment apprécié l'intervention de Irina et de Darel et ça suggère que des discussions doivent être encore menées en profondeur pour pouvoir parvenir à ces résultats-là. Elle a parlé de changement d'esprit, de mentalité, et je pense que cela est essentiel. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Amani. So clearly, call for the definition of this result sector framework, which will be a key instrument in order to drive both measurement of progress, but also more transparency, accountability from the different players in the value chain, which potentially is also one of the barriers to scale up, because that's also a way to somehow reward those that are doing most and vice versa. Peut-être juste une question de suivi pour Dr Nguetia, en complément à ce que disait M. Amani, mais comment vous verriez de façon pratique la possibilité pour vous et pour le SOSTECI de justement capter toutes ces informations qui viennent des entreprises privées, et dans quelle mesure la consolidation de ces informations au niveau du SOSTECI vous permettrait aussi d'utiliser tout ça potentiellement pour pour la mise en place des politiques publiques. Par exemple, au travers du recueil d'interventions sur les zones, comme ça a pu être mentionné, sur lequel il y a le plus de risques ou le plus d'enfants travailleurs ou la plus forte prévalence.
Oui, allô Mathias?
On t'entend bien.
Oui, allô Mathias, vous m'entendez?
Très bien, oui.
Voilà, d'accord. Donc, je voulais répondre vraiment à cette question tout en remerciant toutes les personnes qui sont intervenues et qui vont plus ou moins dans le même sens, hein. Donc, quand j'ai écouté les uns les autres, je pense que tous nous sommes d'accord que la question du travail des enfants, et Yamani l'a dit, est une question de développement social et économique. Et donc, pour cela, il faut avoir donc une vision, il faut avoir une politique sociale, il faut avoir des stratégies. Mais si on va en disperser, c'est clair qu'on n'y arrivera pas. Voilà, donc au niveau de la Côte d'Ivoire, bon, les leçons que nous avons apprises de notre collaboration passée, c'est que le gouvernement a pris conscience véritablement des problèmes que représente donc le travail des enfants. Et le travail des enfants aussi est lié à d'autres problématiques, telles que la question de la traite des personnes, la question de la déforestation, et ainsi de suite. Donc, au niveau de la politique nationale, nous essayons d'avoir vraiment une approche plus ou moins globale de ces questions pour les adresser efficacement. Donc, le système d'observation du travail des enfants va permettre donc, bon, vous le savez déjà, c'est un système d'alerte précoce, un système donc de monitoring et d'alerte précoce qui va effectivement alimenter donc les décisions des politiques. Alors, nous avons initié donc ce processus. Donc, c'est pas un mécanisme qui existait par ailleurs que nous avons juste adapté et implémenté, mais ça a été un processus de conception, d'expérimentation pour arriver vraiment au résultat final que le gouvernement a adopté, a entériné à travers donc un décret et qui institue véritablement un comité de pilotage au sein duquel en tout cas, l'ensemble des partenaires siègent. Donc, déjà, le cas de coordination à ce niveau-là est déjà établi. Donc, au niveau du comité de pilotage, dans lequel nous avons tout fait pour que le gouvernement accepte d'intégrer à la fois donc, les acteurs étatiques, les acteurs du secteur privé, va définir toutes les politiques, toutes les orientations, toutes les actions que le secrétariat exécutif aura à mener. Et donc, nous avons déjà une base. Et c'est ensemble que nous allons donc définir vraiment le type de collaboration. Nous avons déjà commencé avec le SSRTE. Nous avons déjà commencé à travailler donc ensemble. Nous avons défini donc un outil qui nous permettait vraiment de mettre en cohérence les indicateurs et les questionnaires du secteur privé avec donc les indicateurs donc du SOSTECI. Et ça, c'est un travail que nous avons mené avec l'appui donc de ICI. Ces documents existent. Voilà, Amani l'a dit, le document existe. Nous avons déjà tenté une approche à travers donc cet outil. Nous avons demandé donc à l'ensemble de nos partenaires donc de nous faire remonter donc les informations. Bon, la collaboration n'a pas été facile. Nous n'avons pas reçu vraiment tous les retours et ce que nous avons reçu également n'était pas renseigné comme... En tout cas, il y a du travail. Et juste vraiment pour dire qu'il y a encore du travail. Et aujourd'hui, le gouvernement de Côte d'Ivoire a en tout cas adopté en Conseil des ministres, en tout cas le SOSTECI comme le système national de suivi du travail des enfants auquel vraiment tous les autres partenaires doivent pouvoir contribuer. Et ce décret met en place un cadre donc, de coordination et de suivi qui implique l'ensemble des acteurs. Donc, ensemble, nous allons donc définir, comme tu viens de le dire, donc les stratégies et la façon dont les uns et les autres pourront contribuer efficacement. Amani l'a dit, notre démarche, ce n'est pas de dire que nos partenaires du privé n'ont pas le droit de mettre en place le système, non. Mais c'est de faire en sorte que ces systèmes qui sont mis en place soient plus ou moins alignés avec les directives nationales et que ce qu'ils font aussi peut être capitalisé par le système national, de sorte que les remontées qui vont être faites au gouvernement puissent permettre de prendre vraiment les décisions politiques qui puissent nous permettre de travailler tous de manière cohérente et de manière efficace. Donc, voici un peu, je vais dire, l'enjeu de cette démarche, mais je vais dire, c'est ensemble que nous allons pouvoir vraiment voir comment est-ce qu'on va travailler ensemble.
So thanks, Dr. Ngetia, for this very useful example on how private sector systems and public systems can collaborate together, so that notably private sector systems can feed data into the national system and mutually reinforce each other and potentially allow better decision making for public policies. I think we are getting close to the end of our session, but I've been told that we may grab a few additional minutes. So I'd like to move quickly to one practical question for Darrell, a bit as a continuation to this discussion on how to reinforce, synergies, complementarity, coordination, and working together. What are the elements on your side? What are the kind of practical elements where you will see the value for improved coordination and joint action between your system and what government systems are doing? Is there a few examples where there will be value in having this greater collaboration?
I think one area is the remediation, things like social services. We're building up a lot of data about what the kids in our supply chain are doing. We're getting a feel for what their needs are. And a lot of times the government systems could step in there and help with the remediation. So I think that's one area. We're also seeing areas of higher risk and lower risk. And I think that could help government direct their resources to help the maximum number of kids. So there's also areas of collaboration between industry where we're working in the same villages or same communities. There's potential collaboration around, for instance, using the same community liaison people, at least have the actors in those communities work together, giving the same message, or at least coordinating their awareness raising in the villages. So various opportunities.
No, thanks, Darrell. That's very useful to see all those different angles on which there could be on one side a greater coordination between supply chains or joining supply chains to turn that into a landscape logic, as well as beyond stronger collaboration between private sector players, as well as those areas of potential of increased coordination between the public and the private systems. Maybe, and before to end, I'd like to turn to Irina so that maybe you can explain a bit more how you've typically, you on your side and for the development of CLE and Elan, took some of those lessons learned that you've exposed in order to get to that situation where this joining forces was made possible.
Thank you, Matthias. It's not an easy question, and I think there's still a way to go. I think first and most importantly, it was about building trust and rapport. So with many companies from the industry, we have started with individual collaborations and successful projects. We started in 2016 with the signature of an MOU with the government, really making sure that we always focus and align with the Ministry of Education and Education to feed into their national education strategies. And that way we were really able, I think, to understand let's say in some kind of brokerage way, what the different perspectives and objectives were of the different parties. And I think this is super important to find the common ground between all partners, to have and start having a dialogue around common objectives. I think that was really important, and I think still continues to be a challenge as when fine-tuning, I think, some of the partnership principles and details. So I started with the most difficult, but I think most important one first. Then in terms of evidence-informed solutions, as already mentioned, we have really been testing a lot of things over the last 5 years and really made sure we always accompany it with independent evaluations. We have been working with Innovation for Poverty Action. We have been working with JPAL. We have been working with a company called In Veritas to really do broad data collection across the country to understand the need. And so we have been able through that to set the ground for what we call a heat map to really understand which at least regions in country have the highest risk and exposure to child labor, while also displaying, lower quality education indicator levels, as well as early childhood development levels, that allows to have a common understanding of where we should be working. And then really making sure we have those evidence-informed models, such as teaching at the right level, family makes the difference, that we have already tested and that has shown to also be effective as adapted in country. So I think that to the second point, and I think to the first point, we are working on education, so need to further elaborate there.
Oh, thanks a lot, Irina. I think that's important, not only to define the what do we need in terms of stronger collaboration, as was done before, but also the where can we do it, and what can we do, as Darrell did, but also very importantly the how to do it, as you just explained. I think we are probably getting close to the end of our panel, but I just wanted to ask each of the panelists if you want to take like 15 seconds each for any closing remark. I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of, what are the elements of additional innovation, learning that we need in order to improve cost effectiveness, what can be done in terms of defining, common joint objectives and related common result framework to drive more accountability and transparency, but also more willingness and resources from different players. Of course, all these very important discussion on strengthening each respective systems, from the community systems to the supply chain systems to the national systems, defining roles and responsibilities, joining forces where it makes sense, but finding areas of collaboration, coordination, and complementarity to mutually reinforce each other when each player have their own action. But for each of you, if there is any last words that you want to add, please do so. Should we start with Amani?
Oui,
un mot de conclusion.
Quelques secondes. Oui, un petit mot. J'ai retenu dans tout ce qu'on a dit là des mots très intéressants, très forts, tels que par exemple construire la confiance. J'ai entendu également des mots comme dialogue. Et je pense que tout ce que nous avons dit ne peut véritablement se mettre en place si nous ne mettons pas en place un cadre de dialogue permanent. Il ne faudrait pas que chacun reste dans son secteur, mais c'est la communication, l'intercommunication entre les différents acteurs. Il faut qu'on se parle, il faut qu'on dialogue. Mais si cela manque, si je donne un exemple, Nestlé est de son côté, Jacobs Foundation est de son côté, et on parle de mettre ensemble nos efforts sans avoir un cadre de discussion permanent, je pense qu'on ne pourra pas s'entendre. Et pour marcher ensemble, il faut s'entendre, il faut se comprendre. Donc, pour moi, c'est un aspect essentiel, la communication, le dialogue entre les acteurs, entre les parties prenantes. Je pense que c'est essentiel. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Amani. Chanto, in 30 seconds. Or let me turn to Darrell. Do you have any closing remarks, final words, your key takeaway from this session? There's a lot that we've not been able to cover, but I think we've made some progress nevertheless in identifying our joint priorities.
Yeah, let's act with urgency. We can help kids now, so let's get on with it. Let's scale up supply chain systems. Let's get some practical cooperation off the ground. I liked what I heard about having CLMRSs cooperate with Sosteki. Let's get Clay started with Jacob's Foundation and the government. These are practical ways we can be working together. So let's do that now. Thank you.
So a call for dialogue, but also a call for urgency, remaining practical so that we can act now. Irina, any final word for you?
I have nothing to add. It's been summarized perfectly. A call for authenticity, trust, dialogue, but keeping up the speed to actually act and reach the children we aim to serve. Thanks.
Shanto, on your side, going back to the field in 5 years' time in order to see the results from all of that? Well, we can't hear you, Shanto. Well, sorry, so you're not going to have the final word, Shanto, but yeah, that technology is not helping us, and I think that anyway, Zoom is probably going to shut down this meeting by itself anytime soon. So let me just thank again all the panelists for their contributions and all those wise words that you've put on the table tonight, and thanks also to all the participants and all the audience for bearing with us at this late hour, at least in Europe. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to the interpreters as well, importantly, and thanks a lot to the WCF team for hosting and supporting this meeting. Have a nice and rest of the day, or a nice evening for those that are already there. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, well done.